Hello there. Welcome to the kickoff of LT Economy Day. My name is Julie Pham, and I serve on the LT Economy Day committee. I want my co-committee members to get to introduce themselves.
Hi, I am Jennifer Ness, and this is my first year serving on the committee, and I'm super excited about it. I am honorary LT 20 because I've never gone through LT, but I am serving on the curriculum committee, and Rebecca made me honorary LT, so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about this year and all of the amazing things that are happening, and I'm super excited to hear from Chris because he is an expert in all of this stuff, so super excited.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Mefford. I am LT08, which sounds longer ago than it feels, I assure you. I have been on the board of Leadership Tomorrow for several years, and I enjoyed 6 great years on the curriculum committee, including 1 year in which I chaired it. So I'll tell you more about me in a few minutes, but thanks for joining us.
Great. I forgot to mention that I'm LT 16. And if you want to announce or put on your name tag what LT you are, or company or pronoun or anything like that, if you want to change your name, the way to do that is if you go to your picture in the upper right hand corner and you see this ... and you can click on that, and then I'll have this on the menu, it'll say rename, and so you can change that there. And if you don't want whatever you put on there to appear on future Zoom calls, then just make sure you uncheck the box that says keep this setting. And we also want to make sure that we know that this is during lunch time, and so we want to make sure that people feel comfortable and that you are welcome to eat or do whatever you need to do to feel comfortable. We are going to put you on mute. You have the ability to unmute yourself, and what's going to happen is Chris is going to talk for about 30 minutes. And then as he talks, if you have questions, you can put it into the chat window. And the chat is on the bottom in the middle. And you can just chat the questions to everyone. And Jennifer Ness, she's going to look at those questions and consolidate them. And then during the Q&A portion, she will read them aloud. Let's see here. And I actually think that's it. So now I'm going to kick it over to Chris.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thanks, Tamara. Thanks, Jennifer Ness. Thanks, Sue, for all the amazing work leading up to this. My name's Chris Mefford. I run a company called Community Attributes. I work as an economic development strategist and as an economist. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work toward understanding virus impacts and as it relates to the regional economy and all other kinds of things. A little bit about what we're going to talk about, if I can get this going here. Here's what's on the agenda today. I think we're trying to accomplish a few different objectives. One is trying to do our best to serve LT 20, right? I feel so bad for you folks. It got disrupted along with lots of other happenings in our world that we are all adjusting to. So we're doing our best that we can to kind of make good on that and give you an opportunity to have a little bit of an econ challenge day in the face of all this. So that's one of our objectives, and we're super glad to have other folks from the alumni and the board join us as well. I'm going to talk through what in the world just happened, what's happening now, what we think is going to happen next with the economy, and what we need to do. And this is LT, so let's have a talk while we do this, all right? Just because I'm the presenter, that automatically puts me on more of a pedestal than I deserve. And I'm counting on my fellow board members, Craig and Leanne, I'm looking at you, to keep me humble and ask me tough questions and to make it happen. And I'm counting on the class to continue the dialogue that you've been having all year long about your concerns about equity and injustice and how this all comes together. And we're also going to talk about some interrelatedness of LT Challenge Days, which is near and dear to my heart and near and dear to all things LT, about how these things all relate together. And in particular, we're going to talk about public health, of course, and we'll touch on some things of the environment where I don't claim to be an expert, but we want to acknowledge the interrelationship of these things. And I think some of those days, 1 or 2 of those days might have been adjacent to your challenge day for 2020 as well. So class, feel free to challenge me. You can pick on me. You can ask us tough questions. We can have a family dialogue as a part of this. I'm not going to have a slide that serves everything for all these topics to the perfect degree of satisfaction. However, we can have a great conversation about any of these things. And Julie and Jennifer Ness and others, please feel free to interrupt me to help me if I omit something about what the purpose of the day is and how we're doing it. I got a timer going here myself to try to stay on track a little bit. A little bit about my company. I started this company in 2005, which also sounds a whole lot longer ago than it feels now. We do a broad range of things. We do economic research, we do urban planning. I do a lot of strategic planning. I am the sole owner of this company, so I've had all the ups and downs of a small business that come with that challenge, none more so than we're going through right now, I assure you. So that's a little bit about who we are. We're mostly based in the Seattle area. We have done a lot of work across the country and across the world. We've done a lot of work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in particular. We served the libraries group there for a good number of years, and that got us out all over the world helping public libraries. And that was a very fulfilling experience. The Gates Foundation sunsetted that program a couple of years ago. We continue to serve that sector. We do work in real estate, we do work in economic development planning. We've worked in most of the municipalities in this area. So if you want to talk about something really specific and local, the odds are I have something to say about that. So that's a little bit about my company. It's been a good LT tradition, I believe, maybe tradition is the wrong word, but a good practice to talk a little bit about who we are as leaders. And that's been something we've been modeling for a number of years. And I think in the past couple of years, the class has craved a little bit more acknowledgement from the speakers to show some vulnerability and understanding of privilege and how that factors into the perspectives that we bring to these conversations. So I'm going to give that my best shot here as well. And we can either plumb that as much as you'd like. I'm super comfortable and I love those conversations. Or we can bring it back in later on if you hear a bias coming into my speaking. So I just have a couple of slides to talk a little bit about me here to set a little personal perspective, and I'm watching my clock so I don't talk about me for 90 minutes here. I grew up in a little tiny town. Well, by Seattle standards, it's a tiny town. I'm going to show you this. The town's called Ottumwa, Iowa. And the picture on the screen is one of only a few things that people from Ottumwa think we might be known for. That's a short list, but this is a little hamburger stand that has been around since the 1930s. It's, you'd like to think it's emblematic of prosperity and growth. There's a parking garage that was built over the top of it. The locals said, we love the canteen lunch in the alley so much that you can't tear it down, so we're gonna build a parking garage over it. That would give you a false sense of progress and private investment in that community to think that that parking garage was emblematic of the community. I'm going to switch visions here.
Chris, I have the same question, but somebody asked in the chat box, what state is that in?
Yeah, you bet. So here we go. Are you able to see the map there?
Yes.
All right. So this is not meant to be a shameless plug of what my company does, but we find it a useful tool. It shows what the demographics of a community might be in different ways to curate that content. The little red dot there is Ottumwa, Iowa. And for proximity, you can see where the community lies. It's about as flyover as it gets. It's got a railroad track that connects to Chicago with some history, but it's a small town. In Iowa, when you grow up, you learn the difference between small town. And we didn't think of ourselves as a small town. But we were a 2 McDonald's town, all right? That put us on a certain scale. Now, we were not a Taco Bell town. That was a level of affluence that we couldn't quite get to, but we were a 2 McDonald's town. And we were split north side and south side. The river goes through Ottumwa. You see these other towns around. Interesting thing about Ottumwa, about Iowa, there are 99 counties. And in the center of every county is a county seat. And every county seat is exactly 1 day's horse ride apart. And in 2020, that still dictates a lot of the fiscal structure and governance that happens in the state of Iowa. That tells you a little bit about Iowa all by itself. The data on the right show that Ottumwa is not an affluent community. High level of poverty. This is a map we built for the Casey family programs so they could curate indicators that they think are important for focus on community health. So now there's 25,000 people. I want to bring your attention to the race, ethnic heterogeneity in the corner there. This is a very white town, right? I grew up in the 1970s and 80s there. I knew most of the African-American families, most of the Asian families, because there weren't that many. I knew most of the Jewish families. There weren't that many of any families of a minority race or ethnicity. And that's the environment I grew up in. My parents were not affluent whatsoever. We didn't want for anything. We didn't know that we weren't affluent. We lived a great life. I grew up with kids just like me that made a lot of bad choices, were offered the same opportunity, and ended up in a much worse place. And it's interesting to think about that. What was I given? What is my privilege? I had a whole family. My parents loved me. They supported me. I was white. I was in touch at a very young age that all I needed to do was show up to a certain extent, and a certain amount of success would come with that. And I was self-aware about that at a very young age. And I saw a lot of my friends given the same opportunity to make a lot of stupid choices and end up in a lot of stupid places, but I was aware of the privilege that came with that as well. And I'm going to switch back to things today, and then I'm going to move on from talking about me. A little zoom. So now I'm here in Seattle. I've been here for 25 years. This is my lovely family. And I'm showing some vulnerability here. It's not vulnerability. I'm showing some privilege here is what I'm showing, right? And it's important in this COVID conversation we move forward. This is our weekend house. This is our vacation house. About 6 or 7 years ago, we fulfilled a family dream to buy a vacation house. This is over on Hood Canal. My wife's a physician. She's a researching doctor. She focuses on epilepsy at the University of Washington. And when this virus struck, she wanted us to get out of Seattle as quickly as we could. And amongst my privileges, one is marrying a doctor, and that privilege has served me as a parent very well. I am not a strong scientist, and when I have questions about health and public health and science, I just look at my wife's expression. And if she's worried, I worry. If she's not worried, I kind of disengage and I don't get into the details. The virus worried her quickly. It got my attention. It worried me. It still worries me. It still scares me. It scared us. So we are super privileged. I'm going to talk about privilege when it comes to social distancing later on in this talk. And this is my version of it. This is my privilege on the screen. We were happy to get my kids out of their social pressure environment, happy to get some social distance there. And that's where we are. So that's enough about me, but I wanted to set the stage. I wanted to follow that suit of opening myself up for conversation about privilege and what privilege means to me and how I got here in life. Well, Julie, I turn to you as sort of the best model on these conversations starting last year at the Econ Day and other things. Was there more that I should say, or should we move on to the econ stuff?
I think appreciate you sharing that, and let's hear your views on the economy.
Okay, thank you. Well, I appreciate the indulgence. Happy to bring that into the conversation as you wish if you want to talk about my role in this conversation. Okay, so now let's talk about what just happened. And I'm going to try. Actually, I want to challenge us all to be positive and uplifting and looking forward, all right? And that is difficult to do. And it's difficult for me. I've probably given 8 or 10 talks on this, and it's depressing and it's challenging. And I want to find the constructive pieces at the end of how we move forward together and move forward optimistically and positively, constructively. As anyone knows, when I give an economics talk, I like to set the stage a little bit to say, what is it that we're talking about? And And this began many years ago with Leadership Tomorrow, when the curriculum committee asked of me to say, well, what is the economy? And they say, Chris, we go into this challenge day. Many of us at LT are quite blissfully removed from economics. We haven't thought about it since we had to our freshman year in college. So what are we talking about? And this is an important graphic that really shows the economy in full. It shows households and businesses as the two primary entities that exchange goods and services for wages and income. And it shows internally within our economy two important functions, government and the capital markets. Economists tend to think of those things as leakages, when money goes out of that circular flow of businesses and incomes trading goods and services, and that goes into government or capital markets. Sometimes we think of that as leakages because it's going out of that transaction market to drive the economy. It shows, this graphic also shows how important the foreign sector is. And it's the brown pieces off to the right. Without the foreign sector, that pie cannot grow. No regional economy can grow without a foreign sector. And what we mean by that is this: there are only two ways to grow a regional economy. One is through trade, and the other is through importing capital. Otherwise, it's a closed system, and those things spin and spin. Innovation and all that is great, and it results in a shifting and spending and maybe more quality time, but it doesn't grow the pie. And that's what this graph is meant to show, that that important bronze sector outside is critical to expand that. So hold that thought for a second. We'll come back to this graphic in a second. Okay, so what happened? As an economist, when we do economic impact analysis, it's important to at least tell the story of what is it that we're modeling. And this is what happened. I'm no global health expert, but like many of you, I've become more of a public health expert in the past month than I ever thought I would be. And that's a very good thing, or not for the horrible circumstances. But there are these virus events, the virus spread, there's no vaccine, there's no treatment, and we had to react. And so what happened with reactions, there were medical interventions that were quarantined, businesses closed, major events canceled, travel curtailed, social activity heavily altered. So those are the societal activities that go into modeling what we're talking about, the economic impact models. I got started with this work on the COVID virus through the Seattle Chamber and their Business Health Trust, their health care and company benefits arm. They hired us to write a white paper when this virus was just starting to unfold. And we got a lot of criticism for how negative that report was. It was all speculative at the time, or so it felt. And now when you look back at the report that we wrote just a month ago, it looks as plain as the nose of your face. It's matter of fact. It's not telling anything that we haven't lived through. That's just a little bit of history how my company and I have been absorbed in this professionally during that period of time. So this is what happens economically. In the first top left box, consumer spending slows, sales and revenues drop, a lot of things happen, and then the economy reacts to those impacts. Fear and uncertainty. There's nothing worse in business than uncertainty. Businesses actually close, workers' incomes drops, unemployment spikes, financial markets lose faith, and lending capacity is reached. That leads to a secondary wave of economic impacts that we've been going through. Consumer spending slows further, government spending shifts, the government's been spending all kinds of money that they do not have, and we need to talk about that as part of this conversation. Supply chain and support networks fail, private investment declines, and then worse things start to happen, even worse things. Asset values start to fall, charitable contributions drop, and government revenues drop. And then it's a downward spiral, right? It keeps going, and these things iterate on each other until something finally gets in the way to stop it. So back to this chart, this is where those things are interrupted. When you look at that big blue bar across the bottom, that's the consumer expenditures. And you hear the US economy being referred to as a consumer spending economy. And the commonly cited numbers that 70% of our US economy is based on consumer spending. Those pipes, those bands on this chart are roughly scaled by dollar volume. The US has a $20 trillion gross domestic product, and about 70% of that value is derived by consumers buying stuff. So when those economic impacts hit that I just talked through a second ago, and you see that great big red triangle, that's hugely disruptive. It just sets everything in motion in a big painful way, the likes of which we've not seen in our lifetime. And of course, the foreign sector. A lot of those things stop and new money stops flowing in. So we're going to talk about all those things. Immediate impacts, loss of revenue, wages, and jobs. All these industries are affected. When this first happened, there was a lot of focus on what are the immediate impacts, right? Just a few weeks ago, we were worried. We said, oh my gosh, hospitality, retail, restaurants, bars, entertainment, that's the front line of cancellations, if you will, not to borrow the important front line from the healthcare workers, but the first wave of economic impacts. And now what we've seen, of course, is that every sector across the whole economy is affected in one way or another at different levels. Huge concern about independent and gig economy workers. That sometimes refers only to like the Lyft and Uber drivers. A lot of folks that are working without a social safety net. Some of those folks don't even qualify for unemployment insurance because they're not with an employer that pays into that program. The state has responded extremely well to that and to try to broaden those benefits as much as they can. And I think a lot of important reaction has happened accordingly. We can talk about that a little bit more later. So that's what's happened most recently in terms of the kinds of economic impacts that have hit. We'll go into this a little bit more as well. Now, where were we? Let me just set the stage just to remind ourselves. It's April 16th, 2020 right now, all right? This is a slide I gave in a talk, Puget Sound Business Journal Economic Outlook Conference in January, just 3 months ago, all right? 3 months ago. We knew of the virus in China. We knew of something happening. We did not have any anticipation of the economic repercussions here in this area or in the US. We said unemployment rate is at all-time low. It's lower than we ever thought it could be. Economists think full employment's in the 3 to 4% range. It just kept going down and down. We were just thumping our chest about how long in the tooth this economic expansion is and how great things are. No one was saying, oh, but by the way, we have this horrific challenge coming in just a few weeks. So that's where we were. Now, here's where we have been also, which is going to create big challenges for us for the rest of our lives, right? The federal government had been in the habit of spending money it doesn't have for quite a long time. We borrow. As Americans individually, our comfort level with debt has been super high as well, going way back to the 70s and 80s when we started to increase, especially in the 90s. If you look at that bottom chart of debt as a percentage of personal income, and let me just move my legends around, and then compared to savings as a personal income, you can see this dip that it went in 2008. Right at the peak of both of those charts, things changed with the recession that we had in 2008 for just a little bit, but then things kept going back up again. We were happy to see there, as Americans, we were happy to take on more debt as a percentage of our income. And as a federal government, as a society, and the same is true of business debt as well. People were just comfortable leveraging more and more of our future to place bets on the future to pay off new debt incurred right now. That's more acceptable when times are good. When times are hard, that becomes a very, very heavy burden that just worsens things, even worse than the immediate shock and impact of losing income and revenue. Trying to move it forward. Okay, so what's happening now? This is some data that hasn't been released. It will be released. It is what it is. One of your classmates, I don't know if he's on the call, Ashton Allison, is with the Seattle Chamber. Ashton is a very important client of Community Attributes and a great colleague. And Ashton's a great economic development thinker himself. The Seattle Chamber collaborated with the city of Seattle. The mayor's office really led this out first to say we want to do a survey really quickly to understand who's being affected and how, especially small and medium-sized businesses. So we were fortunate at Community Attributes to be able to help in that effort. The Seattle Chamber and other cities throughout the region jumped in on it too to say we rather than duplicate efforts, we want to send this out to our businesses. And this is some results. I'll send out a packet of this presentation. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier as well, so you don't have to take screenshots or pictures or anything. I'll send you a PDF with all the relevant economic data. I might take out the hamburger stand picture before I do that, for example, but I'll send out the important stuff. And you can see what we're going through here. Now, this was just the first round of 3 surveys that we're going to be doing, and this was through the last 2 weeks in March, which by COVID economic impact period is a long time ago. But you can see that most businesses are very worried. The pie chart on the upper right says most businesses are either worried about impacts or worried about staying in businesses, but they're very worried. They don't know if they're going to make it through, or they're fairly certain they will go out of business. Now, there's a selection bias here. This is not an empirical survey across all businesses in King County. This is a call for help. This is an outreach to businesses that says, if you're suffering, we would like to know about it. If a business got this survey and felt like things are going to be perfectly fine, or they're going to get through this relatively unimpacted, there wasn't a lot of motivation to respond back to this. But it was a way to start a dialogue with political leaders to say, look, there are a lot of businesses that are really going to be hurting, and we need to swing into action on this. Here's a little bit more from that same survey to show the types of businesses that responded, and we'll get into this a little bit as well. We also we asked a lot about the ownership to know if these are businesses owned by people of color or by women or other disadvantaged business status, and we're unpacking that data as well. For this first round of the survey, it's generally the same across different demographics of ownership. All small and medium businesses are suffering. It's a little bit differences in the percentages, but for the most part, there's not a great disparity of the immediate impacts associated with ownership, whether it's people of color or women-owned businesses. However, when we talk about recovery strategies, let's come back to that topic. Lessons learned from recovery from Katrina and other places show that recovery is different among neighborhoods. And many neighborhoods with high concentrations of people of color in Katrina recovered at a much slower rate than other neighborhoods. We need to talk about why that was, and what can be done differently to help out in the Seattle area and anywhere to be more equitable in the assistance that we're going to need to give to get out of this. All right, U.S. macro forecasts. If you are a Wall Street banker, it's super important to have some guess of speculation about what gross domestic product looks like in the coming weeks ahead. And it's super depressing, right? These are the range of forecasts from very important institutions in that table, not the least of which is the Federal Reserve Bank, showing a 50% forecast decline of gross domestic product in the U.S. in the second quarter of 2020. That's unheard of. That's the economists are processing that. We're going to talk a little bit more about the virus to put this in context. Now, these numbers get watered down throughout the year for 2020 when we start to have a little bit of a recovery. So it's not the case that for the whole year for 2020, we're going to suffer declines of that much. Roughly, if you divide that by 4, like that 24% number would equate to maybe a 6% total decline if we get back on track in the coming months ahead. And we'll talk about the likelihood of that or the problems with that assumption as well. Big impact. You know, the U.S. and the stock markets and economists hang on ups and downs of tenths of percentages for the gross domestic product. To go from 3% to 4% is a big thing. To go from 3% down to 2% is seen as a downturn in economic growth. To go from 2% of sort of a standard economic growth scenario to a negative 8% is absolutely unheard of. So we're in economic emergency territory that no one in our lifetime has dealt with. We need to go talk to our grandparents, those that are maybe still living, to talk about what they went through in the Depression era and how they made it through. Those are the benchmarks to understand the severity of the economic impacts we're talking about. Closer to home, here's what it's starting to look like. There are probably new data out in the past 60 minutes or so from the state of Washington. They're due to post their data this morning on Thursday morning. They've been doing an amazing job of getting new data out to help people understand what's going on. These are unemployment claims by week in Washington state for 2020. You can see just how we turned on a dime. 6,000 unemployment claims each week was very low, super low unemployment, then all of a sudden things exploded. And this just shows you that scale on which things are exploding. No one's seen this. Our state fiscal system isn't designed to process unemployment claims at this level. It's not designed to pass through that level of government support, and yet we have to, right? We have to keep people well and to keep as many people from suffering as much as we possibly can. This slide shows the sectors that.
Hey, Chris, before you move on, can I stop you real quick?
Yep.
We had a question, and I also want to make you aware that we are at the 30-minute mark. The question is, when it comes to perception of public safety, white communities tend to report more concern despite having less criminal activity. Do you think this self-reported business data may be impacted by similar social/emotional responses?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you're talking back to these, I think you're talking back to these data back here at the survey.
Yes.
All kinds of baggage with these responses, right? So first of all, was a business even a recipient of the survey? This is a selected list that pushed out of different economic development organizations. And different cities do it better than others. The city of Seattle has a pretty darn good list for the minority business ownership, the women business ownership. So they at least have a good list to be able to get it into the businesses that they wish to serve, but by no means are we confident that that list has the coverage, right? So it might have the right focus in terms of reaching the kinds of businesses that we wish to reach, but we do not claim that it has the coverage to reach enough of them. And this is also not designed to solicit requests for direct assistance, right? And so this is meant to be one that they moved very quickly, and that's to their great credit. They wanted to move quickly to see how bad it is so that they could have this data to move forward on advocacy pieces. So for data and analytics, it's got lots of baggage and issues. If you're running economic development for the city of Seattle, it's super helpful to see, yeah, look, it's as bad as we thought it might be. I heard I got 25 minutes. I heard your 30-minute mark there. I'm going to skim a little quicker here then. Okay. We don't need a lot of that blah, blah, blah on different sectors. We can talk about different sectors because they're going to have big time impacts. But a couple of slides I'll slow down on here is one of the equity concerns. And of course, we do a lot of equity analysis with my team using the data that are available to help lend data and statistics to these conversations. Super important conversations. We don't claim to be either public health or equity in public health experts, but I have paid close attention to the write-ups and the articles and the stories that are coming out. And that's why I was sort of willing to just share a little bit up front of my own acknowledgement of my own privilege to talk about this. And social distancing is a privilege. I mean, I showed you extreme privilege, but just the ability to work from home is a privilege that a lot of people do not have. And those industries that are affected most, and go back here to the slide I skipped over, retail, accommodations, and food services, those are just shut down. And there are some employers that are great best practices with paid leave and family leave, but they're already tapped out, right? If they're not getting money, they can't keep that up. I think the best practices among employers that are helping in those businesses are those that can hang on to pay health insurance. You know, one, was it something they offered in the first place? And two, are they able to hang on and do that? And you see the restaurant industry that's responding with great intent and effort to try to serve workers that are being most affected. A lot of great effort is underway, but I just want to get that out there, that we know that there are inequitable impacts that are happening with this, which feeds into the fiscal concerns. We raised this topic in our conversation with the chamber white paper that we wrote, and we just got a ton of flack right away. Most of the audience said, well, not most, but a couple of people just hit a button with, and they say, well, there goes Chris calling for a state income tax. And that's not at all where we were trying to go with that explicitly. We wanted people to start thinking about things that we hadn't heard discussed yet, which is the decline in government revenues that's going to come with this. That's the next wave of challenges over the summer and into the fall when the budget conversations start to happen. We wanted to warm the conversation up. Since then, the government agencies are on top of this. There's great economists and great leaders in our jurisdictions that are working this issue, and our role being out front with the white paper with the chamber is just to loosen that cap for them to have that conversation, but it'll go.
That leads to one of the questions that is out here right now. What should the government's role be in supporting sectors that are hard hit and businesses both big and small? And are we doing enough?
Right. So that's exactly this slide here. Thank you, Finesse. Thank you for that question, whoever that was. We need to do everything we can. And the direct payments and support is a part of the answer with that question. That's what I mean by the state has done really well to expand their unemployment insurance benefits as a part of this. They've shifted workers into that department in Olympia to help to process those claims. That's what a direct payment is that unemployment insurance program. And that's the best mechanism for distribution of money to workers that have lost their income. The federal government is doing what they've done with the $2 trillion package. I might have a slide on that. I might have had it back here. The $2 trillion is roughly 5% of gross domestic product. So if we have a decline of 8% on gross domestic product this year, you can think of that $2 trillion infusion into the national economy of not making us whole, but going a long way toward that. The problem, obviously, and it's in the news this morning, if you want to get into it, is the execution, right? I mean, it's all about execution. Is the money getting into the right hands efficiently? And almost certainly that answer is no. It's not enough money, and it's not being distributed quickly enough and equitably enough. There's just so many problems. The Small Business Association was not staffed to be able to process those claims. The bank infrastructure, the communications, the direction, all the coordination was not anywhere near sufficient enough to allow businesses access to those funds in a timely manner. Now that said, give it a little bit of time. I do, as a small business guy and a tech team myself, I like the phrase launch it broken and fix it live, right? And so they launched it broken, but they had to launch something, and there is money flowing into some people's hands, and we hope that it's having the most optimal impact that it can, and they need to fix it, and they will. There'll be more money, and those programs will continue to get a lot of attention. We're really talking about the government backing up the financial services industry, who has to be there to help back up all the borrowers and lenders, right? Your landlord. If I, as a small business tenant, go to my landlord and say, my revenues have dropped, my cash flow has dropped, I can't make rent this month, that landlord's in a pickle themselves. They have to then go to their lender and say, my tenants can't make rent. I need flexibility on my payments. That lender then needs to say, well, how am I going to cover all the debt flow that I've got on my end? That's where the federal government needs to come in. They come in as the backstop to the financial sectors, who needs to help that flow, cash flow back and forth through all those transactions that are just being strained up and down the economy right now. So I'll move quickly through these and wrap it up here. Sorry.
Before you move on, there's two questions about that survey that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So there are 4,000 businesses surveyed. How many businesses are there in Seattle/King County? And were those 4,000 companies just in Seattle or King County?
Right.
And do you have, or when will you have, impact data by race in Seattle or Washington State?
Can I say the answer is 42 and move on? No, I'm just kidding. Those are big, long questions. The first round of that survey went out to all 3 counties, and very haphazardly, just to get it out there. It was focused on the city of Seattle, first and foremost, and other jurisdictions got on board to help push that out. We ended up with about 5,000 responses total on the first round. There will be a second round launching in a couple of weeks. And in that survey, we will expand the questions to talk about what assistance have you received and how's that going or not going. There'll be a third round in May, in the end of May. So we're hopeful that as those second and third rounds progress and different organizations help to push that out, We have the Seattle Chambers helping with the Greater Seattle Partners, Economic Alliance of Snohomish County, the city of Tacoma is involved. Many cities in King County individually are. We're hopeful to grow that understanding. Again, it's not meant to be statistically representative. It is difficult to construe that into overall economic impacts. We will use it to inform our estimates of economic impacts along with other data that we can bring to bear to make that happen. So I think that answers some of your questions. We will have cuts on minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses momentarily. In fact, I've got it on my screen. I can flip to it. It's not super insightful because it doesn't vary amongst those right now.
Okay, and so do you have the data by race yet?
Not by individual race segments, only by is it owned by a person of color or not? The business ownership, just the business ownership. It's not getting into worker demographics whatsoever.
Got it. And then one more question.
Yep.
Lots of progressive communities are seeing the exposure of these fault lines in our economy and capitalist approach as an opportunity to envision a new, more equitable, more resilient future for communities. As the federal government provides stimulus funding to municipalities, where do you think that funding needs to be applied in order to build a better future for communities?
Love that question. I like the forward-looking piece of that. I like all the complexities of that, and help me out. I know we're at the time run, the presentation bit.
Oh, we actually have until 1 o'clock for this entire session. So right now is Q&A. But if we don't get any additional questions, you can keep going through the presentation. But right now we just have that one question, and we have until 1 o'clock.
Okay, thank you. Because I've got pizza coming at 12:30, so it's good to know that I'll keep it going throughout this. No, I'm just kidding. Those questions, that question is the tail part of our conversation that I really want to get into more dialogue about. So let's keep that in front of us and see if we answer some of this as we go. But then that is the question that was just posed, and that's what I want to have a lot of focus of the constructive conversation next. I just have a few more slides that show some data and some more thinking about what the economic environment might be, and it really gets into that question quickly, I promise. These are different forecasts. This is from the International Monetary Fund, but this is their forecast just a couple of days ago about what they think the bounce back might be. I don't believe this. We'll talk about that in a second. I think it's more positive, and it's not. I have no reason to bias to be more negative, but I think the lingering repercussions are understated here in terms of bouncing back in 2021 in that regard. Here's some work that my team did to do more of a quarterly forecast, and it doesn't go out as far as I think it needs to go, but this is as far as they would let me push them right now. You can see the drastic decline for Washington State in the darker bars. This is for gross state domestic product and gross domestic for the U.S. as a whole. We follow the U.S. economy an awful lot. A huge swing factor for our future is what happens with Boeing and aerospace. There's a great article on Boeing and economics in relation to our national economy and regional economy in the Seattle Times this morning. It's a huge variable to understand what will happen in air travel, the future of air travel, how that flows back to the demand for Boeing airplanes, and what that means for the employment base, which is so important in Seattle, in our region. But we do see pent-up demand rebounding in 2020. Now, I want to caveat this. I want to move ahead to show you my caveats in a second. Right here. So I think any forecast of economic impacts right now is pure speculation until we know when there will be a vaccine, right? We are going to enter this messy economy period that my understanding could go many months, and it could go into 2021, could be as far as a year out. And that messy period is phase 2. So we're in 3 phases, how I see this. The first phase is the phase we're in right now, which is the reaction to the virus and the emergency and to shut everything down to try to get on top of this. The second phase is going to be this messy middle that we need to figure out what that looks like, and that needs to be where the attention is. And what that is there's no vaccine, there's no treatment. And how long is that period going to be? What does that mean? We pin a lot of economic projections on this thing called consumer confidence, right? Consumer confidence. Go back to 70% of the economy based on the consumers. University of Michigan does this great survey that says to all consumers, how confident are you about spending money? Well, now we have a public health confidence question, right? How confident are you to go out and engage in your normal activities without a vaccine and without a treatment? What's that translate to economic activity, consumer activity? That's the huge question that we don't have an answer for. A lot of people are working on this. We're going to keep working on this. What does social distancing mean? More people working remotely that haven't been working remotely. What does it mean for retail? All those are going to be big, challenging questions to answer that we simply do not have confidence in. And until we have a vaccine, we won't have confidence. But if you hear people talking, smart people like Bill Gates and folks that are in on this, is there going to be a sports season next year? Will there be stadiums? Will the Seahawks be able to play? Will there be that many people that can be comfortable going to a stadium to be in an event during this period? I think without a vaccine, probably not, right? And those are dramatic, major economic impacts to our regional economy that are going to play themselves out for quite some time. Huge question marks. And the recovery won't begin until there's a vaccine. We're going to be doing our best to tread water to keep it together during this period of no vaccine. And the recovery period is only going to begin once the treatment is there or a vaccine. My wife keeps reminding me that treatment is almost as good for public health confidence as a vaccine. So they might come up with a treatment quicker than we come up with a vaccine. And then we'll start to see that recovery. So I think 2021 is going to be a pretty miserable year economically. It's not going to continue to get worse, but if at best we might rebound a little bit from where things are right now. Also during that period, we're going to see all these secondary and tertiary effects that we haven't hit yet, right? So government spending money that we don't have, how are we going to pay for that? What's that debt load look like? If any of you are business owners like I am, and you paid your state unemployment insurance tax this past month, holy smokes. People like to complain about taxes because it's one of the only things they feel like they can influence. That tax rate necessarily has to go up to cover that payout of the benefits. Those burdens on our economy are going to hold things down for quite some time, and it's necessary to get through this phase right now. Okay, I've talked about a lot of this already. I want to focus on this for 1 minute here, and then I'm almost wrapping up, and we'll have open dialogue. One of the things LT does great is talk about the interrelatedness of challenge days. And there is always a good health and wellness conversation and how it relates to equity and economy and incomes and opportunity. What had not happened well in our society, in our American society, is an appreciation for public health preparedness. All right, I mean, you hear people talk about the largesse of Western European countries and the paid family leave and the paid sick leave and national health care. We look at that as Americans, or some of us anyway, and say, well, that's a lot of that's a bloated government. Those are benefits and perks that either the private market can provide for it or it can't, but that certainly shouldn't be something that government needs to provide and focus on. And that word public, right, that just hits the market-driven conversation in the gut to say, well, there's no public version of this. This is transactional based. Well, guess what? It should be pretty darn obvious right now that public health is an economic imperative, right? This is about resilience. Do you want to shut it down again? This next 18 months before we have that vaccine in place, or whatever that period might be, are we going to start and stop again? What does stopping look like? Is it like, okay, we've got a flare up in Everett. Now everybody in Everett go home until we say come back. We have a flare up in Pioneer Square of the COVID virus. Nobody can go to Pioneer Square. We don't know what that looks like. It's probably broader geographies than that, but it's going to be geographic based. Public health is going to be about economic resilience, and we need to invest in that. We need to understand, just like having savings on hand to make it through hard times, investing in public health is an economic goal for all market-based driven economies. So I'll stop about that, but that's a big deal to connect through these other things. And I know there's a climate change version of this, and I'm no climate expert, that's for sure, but understanding, I've got two questions to pose rhetorically. Is one question is, okay, if we're able to shut it down and make it through like this to resolve public health crises, then what's a climate crisis look like, right? What sort of crisis is necessary? What sort of acute crisis is necessary for us to enact this level of investment to stop that crisis? Apparently wildfires in Australia is not enough, wildfires in Washington and California is not enough. So what is it that's going to elevate to the point that we have this scale of an intervention, or something that even looks and feels like we're taking those priorities as economic resiliency also? So that's what I want to elevate. It's about economic resiliency. How do you meter this out so it's not this crash and fall moment, but that we invest in that resiliency? All right, I have talked a lot, and I appreciate in the corner of my eye seeing the chat window starting to tip up a little bit. This is a slide I had in my back pocket. I won't go any further than this, but this is a slide that I've spoken to over the years about a little bit with that question that Jennifer Ness brought forth, is what does recovery look like? What does economic development look like? I always preach be a good place to live first, work with what you've got second, and then worry about recruitment and branding to go after what you want third. And you see public health just sort of commingled in the middle there of all the other basic needs and parks and trails and other great stuff. You know, in this moment, there's not a font size big enough for public health to really rank in that graphic. But this is a little bit about my point of view, more to that question that was posed a minute ago. All right, I'll pause for a minute. We were joking before this presentation about the virtual backgrounds. I have a virtual audience in front of me, like I told my colleagues on this before. So right now I'm just picturing waves and waves of applause cascading across the Washington Mall. Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. The biggest turnout ever is that's what my Trump math speaks to me on this. Thank you for indulging all this, everybody.
Thank you. So we do have a couple more questions. So going back, do you want to go back to that original question, or do you want to move forward and answer that last?
Rephrase that question for me, if you don't mind.
Okay. So the question is, lots of progressive communities are seeing the exposure of these fault lines in our economy and a capitalist approach as an opportunity to envision a new, more equitable, more resilient future for communities. As the federal government provides stimulus funding to municipalities, where do you think that funding needs to be applied in order to build a better future for our communities? Yeah,
right. Good. Cool. Well, I think this graphic I have on the screen is not a bad place to answer that. One, picture back to that red box ahead. Also, what government needs to be doing is getting aid in the hand of people that are suffering as quickly as it possibly can to put a stopgap on the damage being done as much as we possibly can. And it's not just government role, to be clear, but the question is about what should the government be doing, and that's my answer. I want to call out private sector leadership on this. In the Seattle economy in particular, we have this crazy mixed love-hate thing with Amazon, and what have they done, workers and all this. They've given millions and millions of dollars to help with the businesses in their immediate neighborhood. And they're just one example, Microsoft and their millions of dollars they've given for affordable housing prior to this, and their own investments to help damage this. But what everyone ought to be doing, anyone with means ought to be distributing those dollars as efficiently as possible, just to help people get through the month, right? We're getting through the month of paying rent and getting groceries and dealing with childcare and helping kids, and I skipped right past the public health bit of it. All right, so the first intervention is to stop the virus. The best economic development strategy possible right now is to stop that virus. Because of that uncertainty that I spoke to a minute ago, it's all purely speculative until that virus is stopped and under control, and there's a vaccine and treatment in place. So that's the first thing, is about the public health intervention. And then the second is to help those that are suffering. So then you get to this longer term piece that I think that question starts to look at a little bit. And I go back to this graphic on my screen. Infrastructure packages are still good uses of the federal capital capabilities, they do create jobs and they do create a platform to encourage other private investment. One very good metric of economic development from the public sector point of view is, do public sector actions and dollars incentivize private investment? Does it create value, right? So whatever the federal government is doing, it ought to be toward private investment that improves communities.
All right. So someone definitely agrees that public health resiliency is critical to maintaining a strong economy. What impact would the investment in creating a strong public health system play as part of the recovery?
Yeah, right. Well, again, I'm no public health expert, so to scale that, to get that to the scale it needs to be, I think is an enormous investment. Right, it's my understanding, to get to the level of testing and the workers that we need to get there. I've had the benefit of listening in on some of our great experts in this state, including the state head of public health, the King County head of public health, and the lead medical officers of most of the major private hospitals in this area. And I just happen to be good friends with Dr. Jeff Baird, who's leading the UW testing facility. So I know from their words what an enormous investment is required to staff the healthcare professionals and to scale up the amount of testing that is needed in the very near term to get a handle on virus management. So what the question has a return on investment implication that I won't be able to land really well. I'm just acknowledging the enormity of the investment that is required. We need to think in generations, though. That's the situation we have, both with this and the environment and climate. When we talk about equity, we're used to talking about racial equity and social equity in the present tense. And we also need to think about equity in the future tense. What problems are we putting off for the next generation? I have a 17 and a 15-year-old, two of them I showed you that earlier when we talked. You know, this virus is going to define the challenge of their generation. And before we thought climate change was, right? Before we thought climate change was their problem to solve because the rest of us aren't getting there quickly enough. Well, now this ROI on the public health system that you're talking about needs to be thought of in the terms of what major investments are needed now, and what do future generations, what's that economy look like to pay off and to make good on that capital investment that's required right now. But you get there. I mean, the answer to that question of what's the benefit of it is back on it's back on these slides, right? As long as there are viruses that can go unchecked and we don't have the health system in place, then the gray shaded area is what you have in front of you. And so if you think that downward fall of more than a third of Washington state productivity is worth avoiding, then that's the level of investment you ought to be at to avoid that risk.
Thank you, Chris. You talked about like some of the larger public sector businesses and their investment that they've already made. The question out here is, what role do you see for philanthropy in this economic relief and recovery?
Yeah, so philanthropy, what's great about philanthropy is agility, right? The challenge of government is what we want out of government is with accountability and connection to voters, and that comes with a lot of process. What's great about philanthropy is private dollars can be put to good use at scale with great leverage, with expediency. And it varies by organization, of course. You've got the Gates Foundation that stands on its own and it's on its own historic context. You've got the Seattle Foundation that's just this great community-focused, mid-scale. They'd be large scale if it weren't the Gates Foundation, but the role of community foundations is super important. And when it comes to local economic development, that role of community foundations is something that needs to be elevated further than it has been. A lot of folks that are tuned into this and understanding that role, but you go back to my framework, what I think economic development is all about. Philanthropy can do a lot of work in that foundational tier, all right? and it can short-rift a lot of the deficiencies that are market failures and government failures, things that we can't expect government to be able to get to at scale. So that's a good role for philanthropy, I believe.
Thank you, Chris. There are not any additional questions thus far. It's about 12:33, so we have about 26 more minutes, but there are not any additional questions.
Well, I would love to hear from people on the call what they see happening. I'd love to hear what the next 12 months look like in each of your perspective. If you can represent your sector or your employer, what are the conversations happening if the governor lifts social distancing concerns at least a little bit? Keep in mind, we're talking about the metaphor that's being used, which I think is fine, is we're not going to flip a switch, we're going to turn a dial upward, right? And so we're going to incrementally open up parts of the economy and not just say, okay, everyone go back to business as usual. So what does turning that dial look like in your world, for your organization, for your employer, for your sector? I would love to hear those stories.
And please do not feel like you have to type that answer into the chat box. You can just unmute yourself and answer that question.
Bring them all together. And maybe any others that we think can come in. Oops, they just muted me on this call.
Oh, you didn't mean to unmute?
Hey, Chris, I can fill a little time here if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Craig.
Craig Parsons.
Nice to see you.
So we're working with a number of large employers, healthcare providers, others, and a lifting of stay-at-home orders does not necessarily equate to practical means for people to return to employment. We've got things like in the construction, these large real estate and construction projects, buildings have never been built with social distancing measures in place. In the tech sector, all these employers are having to think about, how do you get people up elevators in high rises? And, what do you do with these dense office environments you've just built that no longer work for you? So, I think it's going to be a lot of figuring out that sort of practical approach. And then, the whole testing side of it, what requirements do you put on people and on companies to determine their degree of safety to return to work? It's going to be a long time figuring some of that stuff out.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone in the retail sector on the call, or work closely in that sector?
Right. Yeah, Nintendo of America. Dylan Rhodes, he, him, LT20. Yeah, we're in the entertainment sector, and I was reading your research from March predicting that some companies are going to see a temporary spike in demand, and I think we fall into that category, at least temporarily, that there are more people sheltering at home. And, playing video games is one thing that the World Health Organization has recommended to people when they shelter at home. So at least temporarily, we're seeing a spike in demand, but at the same time, our supply chains and marketing and everything else needs to adjust to this new reality. So this background is information about how different parts of the country and the Seattle area in particular are going to adjust to new normals. And we're all kind of wondering what that new normal is going to be. But the information about investment to increase equity down the line and make sure that we have resilience, economic resilience, I think is a good takeaway. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dylan. Hey, I'm interested in that space. I have done studies on interactive media in the past, and I wonder if Nintendo is finding a pull into non-gaming applications of your technologies.
Yeah, that's always a big question. It's hard to say. You don't want to get too far away from your DNA.
Right.
But we do plan the Super Nintendo World at Universal Studios. Obviously, that's going to be impacted. Where everyone's kind of trying to figure out what the new world is going to look like. We've got some fitness applications as well that I think people are using to stay healthy during this time.
Cool. Thank you. That's great.
I had someone message me privately, Chris, and what they wanted to see if you can address is the fact that the essential workers are predominantly people of color, and the areas of high infection rates tend to be the areas of concentration of people of color, not to mention the higher death rates. And what needs to be done just to avoid reinforcing these efforts of structural racism, much less overcome them.
Yeah, great, cool, thanks. I was on the phone yesterday with one of the lead researchers from Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., Amy Liu. She's a fantastic urban economist and is really a national leader on community development and economic development. And one of the models that I think people are turning to for the best playbook for recovery is how the New Orleans area recovered from Katrina. And she made a similar comment that I asked her to speak more to, where she said what we learned from Katrina is that not all neighborhoods recover at the same rate. And I asked her to say more about that, and she really honed in on race to say, well, those neighborhoods in the New Orleans area that were predominantly African American had a slower recovery rate than other neighborhoods. And I asked her why that was, or what could be done about that. And she said that what they learned slowly in the New Orleans area from the Katrina recovery is the importance of engaging community organizations and communities of faith, right? Working with churches, working with community organizations that have that connective communication reach with their communities. And sometimes those entities are overlooked by government for partners to implement things. Whether there's, we know there are these government pathways to offer assistance and to solicit help. Workforce agencies, small business agencies, super important. But what we've been learning a lot since then is how to get to the community leaders and how to solicit their help in broadening the communication, just to learn better about how to distribute the interventions, whatever those interventions might be. So that's the near-term recovery piece. The playbook, I think, for community development and economic development is that same framework like I have on the screen there, to say, well, let's fix things here. What's the food deserts look like, right? If those communities have suffered from lack of access to the services and needs that they have, that's just making things worse right now. So we need to keep that up as a long-term strategy in addition to an immediate recovery intervention.
All right, we have one other question, but before I get to that question, I do want to say that myself, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs every day, not just here in Washington, but all around the world. And they are very, they're in that category in your pie chart that's very, very stressed. Yeah. Especially with all the changing parts, the moving parts with the federal government every single day. On Monday, we were given the numbers of $249 billion have been given out, but there was nothing stating, what would happen after the rest of it was going out. And then last night, this big thing, boom, that says, okay, no more money, application process stopped. So the amount of calls and emails that I'm getting are ridiculous. But I just wanted to give that update just from a certified business advisor perspective and also an entrepreneur myself. There is a question out here. The question is, will taxes have to go up after the economy starts to recover? And if yes, how do you foresee that happening, whether it be local, state, or federal level?
Right, great question. Well, the government is spending money that they don't have, and they should be, to be clear. So either spending that was planned will have to go down, or they'll have to raise more money than what they expected to, right? I mean, it starts there. What you're seeing across all government levels, local, state, and federal, is an immediate triage of priorities, right? All of a sudden, that long-range growth management tied plan doesn't rank as high for spending in 2020 as it did a couple of months ago. So that's an example of shifting spending around to mitigate, to try to take some of the pressure off new funding that will be required. So then on the funding side, the taxes have gone up, like I mentioned earlier with my reference to the unemployment insurance program. It'll put big strain on our tax system. And in Washington State, we have, I think, I'd have to unpack this to deliver it more confidently, but roughly 2/3 of all the public revenue that go into the discretionary spending categories across the state are tied to spending or property taxes, right? So we rely on, sometimes the property tax is referred to as a substitute for an income tax in Washington State. A lot of people view that, some people view that as rather the same level of regressivity or equity. So we rely heavily on high property values and spending. And that spending doesn't only come from retail sales tax, so that's a big chunk of it. But we have the gas tax, we have what we call excise taxes that are really just spending taxes for specific large volume transactions. So all those things will be stressed. The state constitution has all kinds of rules about how you can raise those rates or not. We've got all this horrible encumbrance from the Tim Hyman impacts over the years on property taxes that keep the amount of revenue dollars flowing in check. And the only way property tax revenues go up is when there's new development happening, new construction, like Craig was mentioning earlier. So if the new construction halts, then the dollars that flow from taxing property values really starts to slow down in a dramatic fashion as well. This region hasn't experienced that, right? This region has taken growth for granted for 25 years. We think growth is an input and not something that we need to encourage. So all those things are going to really stress our tax system as we know it. But you can bet that there will be that whole messy different trade-offs of changing programs, a lot of triage. You hear Governor Inslee speaking about that already. A lot of major initiatives that were on the table with hopes of being funded are now being taken off. So it won't just be tax rates happening, but it'll be a decrease in spending also.
Hey, Chris, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Wondering, speaking of growth and taxing, if you have any comments on the jobs tax currently in front of Seattle City Council?
Yeah, I think it's a horrible idea. I think it sucks to no end. So I'll start there with the specificity of my answer to you there, Jonathan. And I don't have any problem with asking employers to help pay for growth costs, you know, and I don't think those employers have any problem with it either. That's mostly that. I mean, that's not even a veiled tax toward Amazon. That's a targeted Amazon. I mean, because Amazon calls it the Amazon tax. The city should not be acting alone on new sources of revenue like that. That should be at best, or at minimum, a regional geographic conversation, and it's probably a state solution that needs to come with that. Who pays for what and how? If you go back to that circular flow chart, every one of those transactions is an opportunity to tax that transaction. So to put that inordinate shift of millions and millions of dollars on a business because they're in South Lake Union creates all kinds of regional problems. Shifts employment into Bellevue. I don't think Bellevue wants Seattle to have that tax because Bellevue is not ready to scale up at the growth that might have to come with that if they don't have a tax like that. So the issue is the local reciprocity and how do you keep communities moving in more lockstep with each other so that there's a more fulsome conversation about how does business pay their share and how do people pay their share and what are the other sources. Thank you for that.
Yeah, this is good. We're at 12:47 right now. We have a little over 10 minutes. Did you have some final thoughts, or does anybody else want to add a little bit of feedback on what they're seeing after COVID-19?
I'll actually add something about two industries that I'm familiar with. So when I work for a tech industry association, and two, my family owns a newspaper. It's a Vietnamese language newspaper, so I can speak on for tech and also for media. And while we see that there are the big companies like Microsoft and Amazon that are still doing well. A lot of the tech startups are actually really hurting. They've also had to lay off people, furlough people. So just trying to understand that this affects different size companies differently within one industry. And then the other thing, my family owns a Vietnamese language newspaper, and it's a struggle because all of the advertising has dried up because all of the businesses that they serve has dried up. And that's the case across all media. And so while media is needed now more than ever, the financing is, the revenue is harder than ever.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing, Julie. The disparity between larger size businesses in the same industry as some of these smaller businesses. For example, I had a client who's an attorney firm who has 9 employees in that firm, and he just got approved the other day for $265,000 in the EIDL, and he's making a decision whether or not he should take it. He was just like, you know what, we're not struggling, we're doing fine. We're actually getting more clients because of everything that's going on. So do I take this money? So it's almost like an ethics issue where other folks in the same industry is like, please let me have your share, you know? But that is our reality right now. And it does have a lot to do with, you know, that different levels of business or also the different categories and industries. So thank you for sharing that. Any final words, Chris? It's about 12:49.
Well, we should definitely wrap up with some positive stuff, right? And some upward lifting things. And there's a lot going on in our community that is very LT in that way. I mean, and there's calls like this. I mean, just big kudos to the LT team of keeping this work happening, right? I mean, that you're keeping the challenge days engaged, keeping the class engaged. You know, we're all seeing all kinds of great outreach amongst our community. Those of us who are fortunate who have our parents still living, you know, we're texting them, and my mom's getting more calls from me than she ever imagined possible these days, right? So there are some.
I read something. I don't mean to interrupt you, but there's one more question, and I just want to talk about that. But I read something that on a regular Mother's Day, which is the highest day that anybody gets calls, it's 800 million calls on that day. But it's been more than that every day in the month of April.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm like, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But there was one last question. Oh, go ahead, and then I'll give you.
I was just wondering, you know, that's in that category. Okay, how do you turn those things off at some point? Also, I'm just kidding about that. Like, okay, mom, I know we set expectations. We're talking every day at 4 o'clock, but you know, let's get back to normal here a little bit. Right?
This is the new normal. Talk to your mama every day.
Thank you.
But no, after all this, will there be a push to require employment like W-2 wages versus 1099 to reduce the gig economy because it hasn't contributed to the pool that pays out of unemployment benefits, for instance?
Yeah, well, I'd say let's zoom up just to one altitude higher. There darn well should be good economy-wide conversations about what's it mean to be public health resilient, right? So whether it's 1099 or the W-2, whether it's companies offering sick leave that haven't offered sick leave before, you know, just being aware of how important those initiatives are important for the economy and for the betterment of all businesses. So we need that. And that's absolutely a silver lining in this that says this is a wake-up call that we need to be more attentive to those issues.
Yeah, I agree. Now to the good news, Chris. The positive side.
You know, there is change accelerating now, and there are economic opportunities that come with that. Back to Dylan's comments earlier, just in the very near term with his company, but also more broadly, right? You know, going into this crisis, e-commerce only amounted for about 11 or 12% of all retail sales nationwide. People in other parts of the country still load up and go to Walmart and load up their carts and come home. That's how they did that. So now with these forced changes, a lot of evolution, innovation, and uptake of technology will accelerate change that was going to happen anyway. And with that is going to come a lot of new opportunity. One of the projects we're involved with a lot is with the industrial areas in Seattle, of what sort of zoning and land uses ought to be a part of industrial as industrial changes. And with the uptick of the delivery systems, you see a lot more interest in that last mile connectivity of distribution systems. So whether it's smaller warehouses closer in or small batch manufacturing happening more onshore than offshore, a lot of the economic progress that that had its own pace prior to this impact is now going to accelerate, and there will be opportunity that comes with that, both economically and on a personal scale, and we'll look forward to see what comes of that. All right, thank you all. It's very indulgent to see your smiling faces. I appreciate that. Good to see you all.
Can I just add two quick things? One, I look forward to at Leadership Tomorrow convening current leaders and all our alums to answer some of the questions that were raised today. We have such an opportunity as an organization to be at the forefront of designing some of these new systems and resetting back to, not back, but resetting to a different and even better way of doing business together. So I hope this conversation, he's in high demand all over everywhere, and for him to take time for us, I'm just very, very grateful. Thank you, Chris.
In the sign language world, this is
Right.
applause. So
Yeah,
we could
good.
all applaud.
All right, thank you.
And just thank you so much. This was great information. Definitely appreciate it. I think it was very, very useful, especially in this time. So
Yeah, thanks.
thank
I
you
think
so
you
much.
do.
Thank you guys for joining in. We appreciate it. And stay tuned for additional webinars from the Economy Day Challenge.
Yes, so on May is going to be Economy Day month, and so we're going to have 5 speakers throughout the month. So I'm going to. We're going to have. We're going to hear from the construction industry, health tech, real estate, a restaurant owner, a nonprofit that helps low-income entrepreneurs, and also on May 14th, we'll have a really interactive trade-offs exercise. So hopefully as many people will be able to make that as possible. And with that, thank you.